The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floors of Buckingham Palace as Kate Middleton walked through the grand corridors. Her heels clicked softly against the stone, each step echoing in the vast space that had witnessed centuries of royal history. Today felt different from all the others. There was something in the air, a tension that even the palace staff seemed to sense as they moved about their duties with unusual quietness. Kate had been preparing for this moment for weeks. The red folder in her hands contained documents that would change everything she thought she knew about her role as the Princess of Wales. Inside were letters, photographs, and official records that had been sealed away for decades, hidden in the deepest archives of the royal collection. The Queen's private secretary had handed them to her just 3 days ago, with strict instructions that she was to review them alone before making any decisions. As she entered the blue drawing room, Kate's thoughts drifted to her children. George, Charlotte, and Louis were at school, unaware that their mother was about to discover something that could reshape their understanding of their royal heritage. William was in Scotland, attending to his duties as Prince of Wales, also unaware of what these documents contained. Kate had chosen to face this alone, knowing that some discoveries required solitude and careful consideration. The room was unusually quiet for this time of day. Normally, there would be the distant sound of gardeners working on the palace grounds, or the gentle hum of staff preparing for the day's official events. But today, it seemed as if the entire palace was holding its breath. Kate settled into one of the ornate chairs near the tall windows, the morning light streaming across the papers as she opened the folder. The first document was a letter dated 60 years ago, written in elegant handwriting that she immediately recognized as belonging to Queen Elizabeth II. The letter was addressed to someone Kate had never heard of before. But as she read the contents, her eyes widened with shock. The Queen had written about a decision she had made during the early years of her reign, a decision that had affected thousands of people but had never been made public. Kate's hands trembled slightly as she read about families who had been separated, children who had been taken from their homes, and promises that had been broken in the name of protecting the monarchy's reputation. The letter detailed how the Queen had struggled with the weight of these decisions, how she had spent sleepless nights wondering if she had chosen correctly. It was a side of her late grandmother-in-law that Kate had never seen, a vulnerable and deeply conflicted woman behind the crown. The next document was even more shocking. It was a series of photographs showing the Queen visiting what appeared to be a remote facility in the Scottish Highlands. The images were dated from the 1960 seconds, and they showed the Queen speaking with young people who looked scared and confused. In the background, Kate could see officials in suits, their faces stern and unwelcoming. The facility looked more like a prison than any kind of care home or school. As Kate continued to read through the documents, the full scope of what had happened began to emerge. In the 1960 seconds and 1970 seconds, the royal family had been involved in a program that removed children from families deemed unsuitable by government standards. These children, many of whom came from working-class backgrounds or had parents who were considered politically problematic, were placed in institutions far from their homes. The program was meant to be temporary, but many of these children never returned to their families. The Queen's involvement had been kept secret for decades. According to the documents, she had initially supported the program, believing it would help protect vulnerable children. But as time went on, she began to have serious doubts about what was happening. The letters revealed her growing concern about the conditions in these facilities and her attempts to have the program shut down. However, her advisors convinced her that ending it abruptly would create a scandal that could damage the monarchy. Kate stood up from her chair and walked to the window, still holding the papers. Outside, she could see tourists gathering at the palace gates, taking photographs and hoping to catch a glimpse of the royal family. They had no idea about the dark secrets that were hidden within these walls. For them, the monarchy represented tradition, stability, and everything that was good about British history. But Kate now knew that the reality was far more complicated. The weight of this knowledge was almost overwhelming. Kate had always known that being part of the royal family came with responsibilities and challenges, but she had never imagined she would have to confront something like this. The documents in her hands represented real people whose lives had been destroyed by decisions made in the name of protecting the monarchy. Children had grown up without their parents, families had been torn apart, and the truth had been buried for decades. As Kate continued reading, She found records of the Queen's later attempts to locate some of the children who had been affected by the program. In the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds, she had quietly worked with social services to try to reunite families and provide compensation to those who had suffered. Many of these efforts had been successful, but some families had never been found, and some children had never recovered from their experiences. One particular case caught Kate's attention. It was the story of a young girl named Sarah, who had been taken from her family in 1967, when she was just 7 years old. Her parents had been involved in anti-war protests, and the authorities had deemed them unfit to raise a child. Sarah had been placed in a facility in Scotland, where she had remained until she was 18. When she was finally released, she tried to find her family, but her parents had died in a car accident just 2 years after she was taken. Sarah had spent the rest of her life searching for answers about why she had been separated from her family, never knowing that the royal family had been involved in her case. Kate felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as she read Sarah's story. The girl had written letters to various government officials over the years, trying to understand what had happened to her and why. She had died 5 years ago, still not knowing the truth about her situation. Her children and grandchildren were still alive, still searching for answers about their family history. The final document in the folder was perhaps the most shocking of all. It was a recent investigation report, compiled by a team of researchers who had been working in secret for the past 3 years. They had uncovered evidence that similar programs had been operating in other Commonwealth countries, with the knowledge and approval of the British government and the royal family. Thousands of families had been affected, and most of them still had no idea about the royal family's involvement. Kate realized that she was now faced with an impossible choice. She could keep these documents secret, as they had been for decades, and protect the reputation of the monarchy, or she could find a way to reveal the truth. Knowing that it would cause enormous damage to the institution she had married into, and potentially affect her own children's future. The silence in the room seemed to grow heavier as Kate contemplated her options. She thought about William and how he would react when he learned about this. She thought about her children, and the legacy they would inherit. She thought about all the people who had suffered because of these programs and their families who were still searching for answers. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, Kate made a decision that would change everything. She picked up her phone and made a call to someone she trusted, someone who could help her navigate this impossible situation. The conversation was brief, but when she hung up, Kate knew there was no going back. The truth would have to come out, no matter what the consequences might be. The stillness in the room was broken by the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside. Someone was coming, and Kate quickly gathered the documents and placed them back in the red folder. Whatever happened next, she would face it with courage and dignity, knowing that she had chosen to do what was right, rather than what was easy. The weight of the crown was about to become much heavier, but Kate was ready to bear it. The person who entered the blue drawing room was Margaret Thompson, a private investigator Kate had secretly hired 3 months earlier. Margaret was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes but a determined expression. She had spent her entire career helping families find missing relatives and uncovering truths that powerful people preferred to keep hidden. Kate had contacted her initially to help with a different matter, but their relationship had evolved into something much deeper. Margaret carried with her a leather briefcase that Kate knew contained even more evidence about the royal family's involvement in the secret programs. Over the past 3 months, Margaret had been working tirelessly to verify the documents Kate had discovered and to find living survivors who might be willing to share their stories. The results of her investigation were both heartbreaking and shocking. "Your Royal Highness," Margaret said quietly as she settled into a chair across from Kate, "I have news that you need to hear, but I want you to know that what I'm about to tell you will be difficult to process." Kate nodded, steeling herself for whatever was coming. She had already read enough to know that the situation was far worse than she had initially imagined. Margaret opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder filled with photographs, letters, and official documents. "We've found 47 survivors who are still alive," she began. "These are people who were taken from their families as children and placed in the institutions you read about. Most of them are now in their 60s and 70s, and many of them have children and grandchildren who have been searching for answers about their family history." Kate listened in stunned silence as Margaret described the lives of these survivors. Many of them had struggled with mental health issues, addiction, and difficulty forming relationships as a result of their experiences. Some had spent their entire lives feeling like something was missing, never understanding why they felt so disconnected from the world around them. Others had been told lies about their families, convinced that their parents had abandoned them or that they had died. One story in particular stood out to Kate. It was about a man named James Morrison, who had been taken from his family in 1969 when he was 6 years old. His father had been a trade union leader who had organized strikes against government policies, and the authorities had decided that James would be better off in care. James had spent 12 years in various institutions before being released as a young adult. He had tried for decades to find his family, but all the records had been sealed or destroyed. Margaret showed Kate recent photographs of James with his own children and grandchildren. He was now 71 years old and worked as a gardener in a small town in Wales. He had built a good life for himself despite his traumatic childhood, but he had never stopped wondering about his original family. Margaret had located James's younger sister, who had been just 2 years old when he was taken. She was now in her late 60s and had grown up believing that her older brother had died in an accident. They lived just 60 miles apart, Margaret said, her voice heavy with emotion. They've been separated for over 50 years, and neither of them knows that the other is alive. James's sister, Mary, has a photograph of him on her mantelpiece. She talks to it every day, telling her deceased brother about her life and her family. Kate felt her heart breaking as she imagined the pain that James and Mary had endured for so many years. The separation had affected not just them, but their children and grandchildren as well. James's children had grown up knowing that their father was searching for his family, and Mary's children had heard stories about their uncle who had died too young. The ripple effects of the royal family's decisions had touched multiple generations. Margaret continued to share more stories, each one more heartbreaking than the last. There was Elizabeth, who had been taken from her family at age 8 and had spent her entire life believing that her parents hadn't wanted her. There was David, who had been told that his family had died in a house fire, only to discover years later that they had actually been searching for him until the day they died. And there was Patricia, who had been separated from her twin sister and had spent 60 years feeling like half of herself was missing. As Kate listened to these stories, she began to understand the full scope of the pain that had been caused by the royal family's involvement in these programs. It wasn't just about the children who had been taken. It was about the parents who had spent their lives searching for their missing children, the siblings who had grown up feeling incomplete, and the grandchildren who had never known their extended family. Margaret then showed Kate something that made her gasp in shock. It was a letter written by King Charles, then Prince Charles, to his mother in 1975. In the letter, a young Charles expressed his concerns about the secret programs and urged the Queen to find a way to end them. He had learned about the situation through his own network of contacts and was deeply disturbed by what he had discovered. "Your son knew about this," Margaret said quietly. "He tried to convince his mother to shut down the programs, but he was told that it wasn't his place to interfere in government policy." The letter shows that he continued to push for change throughout the 1,970 seconds, but he was ultimately unsuccessful. Kate realized that this meant King Charles had been carrying the weight of this knowledge for nearly 50 years. He had watched as families remained separated and as survivors struggled with the consequences of decisions that he had opposed. The burden of this secret had likely affected him deeply, contributing to his well-known interest in social causes and his efforts to help disadvantaged communities. Margaret's investigation had also uncovered evidence that some members of Parliament and senior civil servants had profited from the programs. Companies that ran the institutions had paid bribes to ensure continued government contracts, and some officials had received substantial payments for their cooperation. The corruption had gone all the way to the top levels of government, making it even more difficult for the royal family to speak out without causing a major constitutional crisis. "There's something else," Margaret said, pulling out another folder. "We've found evidence that similar programs were operating in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The British government exported these policies to the Commonwealth countries, and thousands more families were affected. The royal family's representatives in those countries were fully aware of what was happening." Kate felt overwhelmed by the scope of the cover-up. What had started as a British program had become an international scandal affecting families across the Commonwealth. The royal family's silence had allowed these policies to spread and to continue for much longer than they might have otherwise. Margaret showed Kate letters and documents from the Governor-General offices in various Commonwealth countries, all acknowledging their awareness of the programs and their agreement to maintain secrecy. The coordination between different governments had been extensive, with regular meetings and progress reports ensuring that the programs continued without public knowledge. The survivors in other countries have started organizing, Margaret explained. There's a group in Canada that has been pushing for a government inquiry, and similar groups are forming in Australia and New Zealand. They don't yet know about the royal family's involvement, but they're getting closer to the truth. It's only a matter of time before someone makes the connection. Kate realized that she was sitting on information that could trigger international scandals and potentially threaten the monarchy's relationship with Commonwealth countries. The revelation that the royal family had been involved in separating thousands of families across multiple countries would be devastating to their reputation and could lead to serious political consequences. As Margaret packed up her documents, she left Kate with one final piece of information. "There's going to be a reunion," she said. "James Morrison and his sister Mary are going to meet for the first time in 54 years. It's happening next week, and James has specifically asked if there's any way that someone from the royal family could be there. He doesn't know about the family's involvement in his case, but he feels that having a royal presence would somehow make the moment more meaningful." Kate stared at Margaret in disbelief. James Morrison, a man whose life had been shattered by royal decisions, was asking for a member of the royal family to witness his reunion with his sister. The irony was almost too much to bear, but Kate also saw it as an opportunity. If she attended the reunion, she could begin to take responsibility for the royal family's actions and start the process of making amends. As Margaret left the room, Kate was once again alone with her thoughts. The weight of everything she had learned was almost crushing, but she also felt a sense of clarity about what she needed to do. The royal family had caused immense pain through their actions and their silence, and it was time for them to take responsibility for the consequences. Kate picked up her phone and made another call. This time, she was calling King Charles directly. It was time for the royal family to face the truth about their past, and to find a way forward that honored the survivors and their families. The conversation would be difficult, but Kate knew that it was necessary. The silence had gone on for too long, and the time for truth had finally come. The phone call with King Charles had been one of the most difficult conversations of Kate's life. When she told him about the documents she had discovered and Margaret's investigation, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, the king's voice came through, heavy with emotion and years of suppressed guilt. "I've been waiting for this day for 50 years, he had said quietly. "I always knew that someday, someone would find the truth. Part of me is relieved that it's finally happening, even though I know the consequences will be severe." Charles had agreed to meet with Kate immediately, and within hours, he had flown back to London from his estate in Scotland. Now, as Kate sat in the king's private study at Clarence House, she could see the weight of decades of secrecy on his face. Charles looked older than his years, and his hands shook slightly as he held the same documents that had shocked Kate just days earlier. He read through them slowly, occasionally closing his eyes as if the words were too painful to bear. "I tried to stop it," Charles said finally, setting the papers down on his desk. "When I first learned about the programs in the 1970 seconds, I was appalled. I wrote letter after letter to my mother, to government ministers, to anyone who would listen. But I was told repeatedly that it wasn't my place to interfere, that the programs were necessary for national security and social stability." Kate listened as Charles described his decades-long struggle with the knowledge of what the royal family had done. He had thrown himself into charitable work, particularly focusing on disadvantaged youth and broken families, as a way of trying to make amends for the sins of the past. His work with the Prince's Trust had been motivated partly by his desire to help young people who had been failed by the system. Though he had never been able to speak publicly about his real motivations, there were nights when I couldn't sleep. Charles continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I would think about all those children, all those families, and I felt so helpless. I tried to convince myself that at least some good was coming from my charitable work, but I always knew it wasn't enough. How could it be? We had destroyed thousands of lives, and we were doing nothing to acknowledge it or make it right." Charles showed Kate additional documents that he had kept in his personal safe for decades. These were letters from some of the survivors who had managed to track down the royal family's involvement and had written directly to him. Most of these letters had been intercepted by his staff and never reached him, but a few had made it through. Reading them had been torture for Charles, but he had kept every single one as a reminder of the pain that the royal family's actions had caused. One letter in particular had haunted Charles for 20 years. It was from a woman named Grace Williams, who had been taken from her family in 1971 when she was 9 years old. Grace had eventually tracked down her family's story and learned about the royal involvement. In her letter to Charles, she didn't ask for money or an apology. Instead, she simply wanted him to know that she had spent her entire adult life helping other people find their missing family members, and that she hoped someday the truth would come out so that other families wouldn't have to suffer in silence. Grace had died 3 years earlier, still waiting for acknowledgement of what had happened to her. Her children had found the letter to Charles among her belongings and had been shocked to learn about their mother's connection to the royal family. They were among the survivors that Margaret had tracked down in her investigation. "We have to do something," Kate said firmly, looking directly at Charles. "These people have waited long enough for the truth. We can't continue to let them suffer in silence while we protect our own reputation." Charles nodded slowly, his face grave with the weight of the decision they were about to make. "I know," he replied. "I've known for years that this day would come. The question is how we handle it. If we simply release the information without any plan for making amends, it will be a disaster for everyone involved, including the survivors. We need to find a way to take responsibility, while also providing real help and support to the people we've harmed." Over the next several hours, Kate and Charles worked with Margaret and a small team of trusted advisors to develop a plan for revealing the truth about the royal family's involvement in the secret programs. They decided that the announcement would come in stages, beginning with a private meeting with the survivors and their families, followed by a public statement, and then a comprehensive program of support and reparations. The first step would be for Kate to attend James Morrison's reunion with his sister Mary. However, instead of simply being there as a guest, Kate would reveal the truth about the royal family's involvement and personally apologize to James and Mary on behalf of the monarchy. It would be the beginning of a long process of truth-telling and reconciliation. 3 days later, Kate found herself driving through the Welsh countryside toward the small community center where James and Mary's reunion was taking place. Margaret sat beside her in the car, along with a single protection officer who had been sworn to secrecy about the purpose of their visit. Kate had insisted on keeping the entourage small, wanting the focus to be on James and Mary rather than on royal protocol. As they approached the community center, Kate could see a small crowd of people gathered outside. James and Mary's extended families had come to witness the reunion, along with a few local residents who had known the family for years. None of them knew that Kate was coming, and they certainly didn't know about the bombshell announcement she was about to make. Kate took a deep breath as their car pulled up to the building. Inside, she knew that James Morrison was about to see his sister for the first time in 54 years. She also knew that within the next hour, she would be revealing a truth that would change both of their lives forever, and potentially change the future of the monarchy itself. As Kate walked toward the building, she could see through the windows that the reunion had already begun. James, now 71, with gray hair and wearing his best suit, was standing face to face with Mary, who was 68 and had tears streaming down her face. They were holding hands and staring at each other in disbelief, both of them struggling to process the fact that they were finally together again. Kate paused at the entrance, overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment. These two elderly people had spent their entire lives wondering about each other, carrying the pain of separation that the royal family had caused. In a few minutes, she would have to tell them that their suffering had been the direct result of decisions made by her husband's family. Decisions that had been kept secret for decades. Margaret touched Kate's arm gently. "Are you ready?" she asked quietly. Kate nodded, though her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone would be able to hear it. She had given speeches to thousands of people, attended state dinners, and handled countless royal duties. But nothing had prepared her for this moment. As Kate entered the community center, the room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at her, their faces showing confusion and surprise at seeing the Princess of Wales in their small village hall. James and Mary were still holding hands, but they too were staring at Kate with bewildered expressions. "Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Edwards," Kate said, addressing James and Mary by their surnames. "I am so sorry to interrupt this special moment, but there is something I need to tell you both, something that should have been told to you many years ago." The room remained completely silent as Kate began to speak. She told James and Mary about the documents that had been discovered, about the royal family's involvement in the programs that had separated them, and about the decades of secrecy that had followed. As she spoke, she could see the shock and pain on their faces, gradually turning to understanding. I am here today not just as a representative of the royal family, but as someone who has children of her own and cannot imagine the pain that you and your families have endured, Kate continued, her voice thick with emotion. What was done to you was wrong, and the silence that followed was equally wrong. I am here to apologize, and to promise you that we will do everything in our power to make amends. James Morrison, the man who had spent his entire life searching for his family, looked at Kate with tears in his eyes. Your Highness, he said slowly, I don't understand everything you've just told us, but I want you to know something. I never gave up hope that someday the truth would come out. I always believed that someone with courage would eventually step forward and tell us what really happened. Mary Edwards, who had spent 66 years believing her brother was dead, reached out and took Kate's hand. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for having the strength to tell us the truth. It doesn't change what we've lost, but it means everything to know that someone cares enough to acknowledge what happened. As the three women stood together in that small community center, surrounded by families who had been torn apart and brought back together, the weight of history seemed to shift. The silence that had filled the room when Kate first looked down at those documents had been broken, and a new chapter in the story of the British monarchy had begun. The truth was finally out, and while the consequences would be enormous, Kate knew that they had done the right thing. The stillness that had filled the room at Buckingham Palace had been replaced by the sound of healing beginning. And even though the road ahead would be difficult, Kate felt a sense of peace that she hadn't experienced in weeks. The king himself would feel the impact of this moment, as would the entire institution of the monarchy. But sometimes the most important changes require the courage to face uncomfortable truths.